uno sviluppo di una forma letteraria che ha avuto sempre e ha avuto dei maestri esemplari, tra cui appunto Cormac McCartney. Al di là della personale esperienza di lettura di Cormac McCartney, che mi ha subito affascinato e che è sicuramente un personaggio che non si può tralasciare, ecco, diciamo così. Quindi i ragazzi collegati prima o poi leggano qualcosa di Cormac McCartney, ecco, dalla trilogia The Road alla strada, ma poi uno si appassiona, legge di tutto, anche Sunset Limited, Satri, eccetera. Ecco, al di là di questo, ecco, che fa parte di un'esperienza personale di lettura, sono proprio i libri, vedete ragazzi, che vi hanno detto di leggere i vostri insegnanti fin dai tempi in cui siete approdati alla scuola, fondamentalmente. Poi io credo che anche i presenti insegnanti vi abbiano detto che bisogna leggere dei libri e qualche volta anche leggerli in lingua originale. Ecco, sia un passaggio fondamentale per comprendere non solo quale sia il messaggio che ci vuole dare l'autore, ma anche per riuscire a comprendere sempre di più i tanti messaggi che sono intorno a noi e avere sempre di più una capacità di conoscere. Certo, noi oggi con Diletta ci addentriamo in un ambito molto particolare e probabilmente anche molto suscettibile di futuro, no? Perché questo tipo di letteratura o la visione che si ha della realtà talvolta è così complessa e indecifrabile che l'invenzione, l'immaginazione diventano incredibili, ecco, e creano scenari e paesaggi che non ci saremmo mai immaginati. Però in fondo questo in letteratura è sempre accaduto, quindi non abbiamo problemi a pensare che tra un poema antico e un The Road ci possono essere tranquillamente delle similitudini. Però appunto l'esperienza del leggere è molto bella, io la consiglio a tutti e soprattutto è importante, ragazzi, che ci siano delle persone che studiano queste cose, perché sembrano persone che un po' fuori dal mondo, no? Cosa vuol dire? Adesso magari ci dirà anche qualcosa Diletta sulla sua esperienza. Cosa vuol dire studiare queste cose? No? Sarebbe molto più pratico studiare una cellula o qualcosa di chimica, un nuovo farmaco, eccetera, eccetera. Ma anche questo ha un suo peso e una sua rilevanza per tutti quanti noi. Quindi grazie a tutti quanti, voi collegati, i docenti, ancora una volta l'ex studentessa Diletta De Cristofaro, che noi ricordiamo con piacere, e oltre a questa occasione magari altre occasioni potranno arrivare per tutti quanti noi. Bene, grazie.
Grazie mille. No, grazie mille davvero anche per questo invito, ovviamente sia al preside che ovviamente a tutti gli insegnanti che hanno lavorato a questo evento. Ed è davvero un piacere anche vedere appunto alcune delle mie insegnanti, perché appunto sono stata una studentessa del liceo Banfi al classico un po' di anni fa, ed è davvero un piacere appunto rivedere le mie insegnanti nel pubblico. Peccato che appunto sia solo virtualmente.
Vogliamo dire, scusa Diletta, vogliamo dire una cosa riguardo appunto alla conferenza. Allora pregherei per una migliore anche connessione di togliere appunto i video e anche i microfoni, e se alla fine della conferenza qualcuno volesse porre delle domande può comunque scrivere in chat. E poi la collega di Staso, che con me si è alternata quando la dottoressa Diletta De Cristofaro era ai tempi la nostra studentessa, raccoglierà appunto delle domande significative per poi porle alla fine appunto della conferenza. Prego.
Ok, perfetto. Sì, io parlerò appunto per circa 45 minuti, 50 minuti e poi appunto ci sarà tempo per delle domande. Allora, aspetta che condivido le slide. Riuscite a vedere le slide?
Sì.
Ok, ottimo. Ok, passo all'inglese allora, però se appunto c'è qualche cosa che non è chiaro, magari appunto se lo scrivete nella chat, poi magari qualcuno mi faccia sapere, perché appunto io la chat non riesco a vederla mentre condivido lo schermo. Ok. So this is the outline of today's lecture so that you have an idea of what kind of elements I'll be covering in the next 45 minutes or so. So I'll begin by discussing the genre of Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road, post-apocalyptic fiction, in relation to the apocalyptic imagination that is everywhere in contemporary culture. I'll then turn to an event, the terrorist attack of 9/11, that have been read through apocalyptic lenses and that really form the historical backdrop of the moment in which The Road was written. So The Road was published in 2006, so just a few years after the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001. And then I'll turn to our author, Cormac McCarthy, to some possible interpretations of the novel. In particular, I'll be talking about The Road as a novel concerned with our current environmental risks, so with the idea of climate breakdown, but also its engagement with a typical kind of image for contemporary, for actually American literature more broadly and American culture more broadly, which is the image of the road. And I'll finally be focusing also on the novel's style, and so the way in which the novel is written actually contributes to create this kind of dystopian, hopeless future post-apocalyptic world. So let's begin with a discussion of genre. So McCarthy's The Road is obviously a post-apocalyptic novel, so a novel that takes place after a devastating catastrophe, which, however, as I'm sure you know if you've read the book, remains unspecified. We don't really know what has happened. So critics have made several hypotheses about what might have happened to actually produce this kind of, again, hopeless dystopian future scenario. So they've talked about a nuclear holocaust. They've talked about environmental breakdown. They've talked about potentially an asteroid hitting Earth. But McCarthy doesn't really give any clue in terms of what might have happened. And I think that this is really one of the most fascinating aspects of the novel. So as readers, we can imagine ourselves what the novel's apocalypse might have been. And perhaps this will tell us something interesting about ourselves, about our fears when it comes to the future. So what we do know is that the protagonists, a father and son, whom you can see on the slide in a frame from the 2009 filmic adaptation of the novel, these two are traveling on a naturally desolate road towards a coast in the hope that there the situation will be better. But it soon becomes clear that actually the father doesn't really have many hopes that the situation there will be better, or indeed that there is anywhere else in the world where life, a good life, could be possible. So whatever catastrophe might have happened has produced a fully inhospitable world. So there is little sign of life anywhere. There are pretty much no plants that are alive, no animals. There's a dog that appears at some point, but quickly disappears. Possibly it's been eaten. And human society is now so degraded that some human beings even practice cannibalism. So again, what McCarthy gives us is an utterly dystopian future, an utterly terrifying, frightening future. And in this sense, The Road is part of an ever-growing body of literary texts, contemporary literary texts, that imagine future post-apocalyptic worlds. So you have a few examples on the slide. These are all novels that were published after 2000, so in the 21st century. What brings these texts together is that they're not just about the apocalypse and obviously the following post-apocalyptic world, but they're also all literary post-apocalyptic novels. And what I mean by literary is that they're not written by typically science fiction authors. So when you think about the apocalypse, you might expect potentially a science fiction author, so somebody that for a living, writes about the future, speculates about what shapes the future might take, you might expect this kind of author to write about apocalyptic scenarios. But again, these novels on the slide, just like The Road, are all written by authors that generally do not write science fiction. So The Road, for instance, is McCarthy's only post-apocalyptic novel, and McCarthy is definitely not a science fiction writer. So what's interesting is then that apocalyptic worlds are now being explored not only in science fiction, but in mainstream literature as well. And this tells us something very important about contemporary culture, that we are obsessed with the thought of our own end. So this sense of an approaching apocalyptic catastrophe, the lack of belief in the future, are really widespread in contemporary culture. You can find it in movies, and there are a few examples on the slide, but you can also find it in video games. Again, a few examples that you might be familiar with on the slides. You can find it in ads, but also in the news. But what exactly is the apocalypse? What do we mean with this notion of the apocalypse? And what is the history of this notion? Well, apocalypse, obviously today, when you think about the apocalypse, when you think about apocalyptic narratives from movies to novels, you're probably thinking about a catastrophe, right? You're thinking about a disaster of devastating proportions and consequences, so much so that when we think of an apocalyptic movie or an apocalyptic novel, we think of a narrative that represents the end of the world as we know it. And so we generally think of these narratives as imagining a dystopian scenario, a dystopian aftermath after the apocalyptic event. But catastrophe and of the world, these are not really the etymological meanings of the term apocalypse. Those of you that come from Liceo Classico, that are studying ancient Greek, might know very well that apocalypse actually comes from the Greek apokalyptein, which etymologically means revelation. And the most famous Christian apocalyptic text, so a text that imagines the apocalypse within the Bible, is the Apocalypse of John, also known as the Book of Revelation. And this is mentioned in the second definition on the slide. So when we think of apocalypse now, we think again of a dystopian catastrophic event. But this kind of dystopian meaning isn't really part of the etymological origins of the term apocalypse. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these origins of the term apocalypse and what they might tell us about the contemporary apocalyptic imagination. So the painting on the slide shows John, who is the author of the Book of Revelation in the Bible, receiving his revelation from an angel on the island of Patmos. So what is revealed to John? Well, first of all, catastrophes and the end of the world are revealed, which is why from the idea of revelation, the term apocalypse then comes to have this meaning, this contemporary meaning of catastrophe. So on the slide, you can see a representation of an episode, again, from the biblical Book of Revelation, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And these horsemen are generally interpreted as representing war, famine, death, and conquest, which, together with a series of other disasters, bring about the end of the material world. But more fundamentally, the Book of Revelation is about what happens after these disasters. And what happens after these disasters is that there is this revelation of a divine kingdom of the New Jerusalem. So on the slide, you can see, again, John, the author of the Book of Revelation, receiving this revelation of this utopian, peaceful world that will be the New Jerusalem. So it's precisely this idea, so this revelation of a utopian world, a world of peace, a world of prosperity, rather than the revelation of dystopian catastrophes, that are really at the center of religious apocalyptic narratives. So to put it with a kind of pun, with a kind of joke, in the original meaning of the word apocalypse, the end isn't really the end of the world at all, but it actually leads to a new utopian beginning. And of course, this kind of revelation, this new beginning, is not at all what happens in a book like The Road, right? Again, in The Road, the apocalypse really brings about, produces a totally hopeless world, a world that basically has no future at all. So as Elizabeth Rosen writes in the quotation that you can see on the slide, so there is a shift, a change in the contemporary imagination of apocalypse, from apocalypse as a kind of utopian revelation to apocalypse as a dystopian catastrophe. And this shift is a shift in a story that was once grounded in hope about the future, but that has now become instead a reflection of fears and disillusionment about the present. So the sign that you see on the slide, which is a sign that was put outside of a bookshop a few years ago and then went viral all over the internet, really speaks precisely to this idea of fears and disillusionment about the present. So post-apocalyptic fiction, this sign suggests, is no longer just fiction, but actually current affairs. So really the very stuff of the world that we live in. So The Road really reflects this sense of widespread fears, disillusionment about the present, but also, of course, about the future. Specifically, in the case of The Road, we can link the novel's apocalyptic imagery, the novel's use of the theme of the apocalypse, to an American catastrophe, 9/11, that was explicitly framed, described in terms of an apocalyptic event. So 9/11, probably know this already, refers obviously to the 11th of September of 2001. The term 9/11 follows the kind of American convention of putting the month before the day. And on the 11th of September 2001, there was obviously a terrorist attack. So a total of 4 planes were hijacked by Islamic terrorists, hitting the Pentagon in Virginia and the World Trade Center in New York. It was the deadliest terrorist attack on US soil in US history. It resulted in nearly 3,000 deaths and over 25,000 injuries. So obviously this was an exceptional event. So exceptional that I'm sure you will have noticed that the year 2001 isn't even named in the term 9/11. So this logic goes that the attacks were so exceptional that we don't even need to specify the year. We should all know when 9/11 actually took place. And because it was so exceptional, so catastrophic, 9/11 was immediately read, described, talked about in apocalyptic terms. Of course, in the sense of a catastrophic event, rather than, again, that kind of original etymological sense of apocalypse as revelation of a better world. So on the slide, you can see 2 images from 2 newspapers which explicitly use this term apocalypse. So on the left, there's the front page of the Daily Mail immediately after 9/11. So this was from the 12th of September 2001. And then on the right, you have an article from the New York Times, which looks back on 9/11, 10 years after the attacks took place. And I've pasted some sentences from this article from the New York Times, which consisted in kind of oral testimonies of the time. Because in these testimonies, you can see how people that were there during the attacks and that, of course, survived the attacks, saw the day, saw the attacks through lenses informed by apocalyptic disaster movies. So on the day itself, in following weeks, months, even years, television commentators, but also, again, the survivors, use sentences like, it was like a movie, it was like Independence Day, it was like Die Hard, Armageddon. And this was because, and this is the other quotation that you have on the slide, as philosopher Slavoj Žižek remarks, the shot of frightened people running towards the camera ahead of the giant cloud of dust from the collapsing tower was reminiscent of spectacular shots in a catastrophe movie. So people were reminded of catastrophe movies when looking at shots or footage of 9/11. So the apocalyptic imagination, that imagination of disaster movies, was seen as the most useful to help people come to terms with this national catastrophe of 9/11, to express the horror that people witnessed on that day. And there was, of course, a strong literary response to 9/11 in the United States, but also beyond. So many literary critics actually speak of the 9/11 novel as a genre in itself. So you have a few examples on this genre on the slide. These are all novels that deal very directly with the attacks. So they represent the attacks. They make 9/11 their kind of direct focus. So just to give you one example, Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close. You might have seen, for instance, the movie adaptation, or maybe you've read the novel, as its protagonist, a child whose father died in the World Trade Center. So again, these are all novels that directly represent the attacks. But there are other potential strategies to deal with, engage with a traumatic event like 9/11 in literature. Strategies that are less direct, more metaphorical, more figurative. And one of these strategies is, for instance, using the motif of the apocalypse as The Road does. So the quotations on the slide are all from this literary critic, Richard Gray, that has written quite a lot on The Road in terms of reflecting this catastrophe of 9/11. So the first quotation on the slide, he writes, "The determining feature of trauma," and obviously 9/11 is here seen as a traumatic event, the determining feature of trauma is that it is unsayable. So perhaps the way to tell a story that cannot be told is to tell it aslant, to approach it by circuitous means, almost by stealth. This is the strategy of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. So in Gray's reading, the use of apocalyptic imagery in The Road serves as a way to express the traumatic unsayable of 9/11. So something that cannot be said fully, something that cannot be represented directly because it is hugely traumatic, hugely horrific. So the image of apocalypse then serves as a way that is less direct to deal with this catastrophe, with this traumatic event, than, for instance, actually representing a terrorist attack. And for instance, Gray actually argues, and it's an interesting interpretation, you might agree or disagree, that the reason why the apocalypse remains unspecified and unrepresented in The Road is precisely because it reflects this kind of traumatic, unsayable, something that, again, cannot be fully said. Gray also argues, and it's the second quotation on the slide, that The Road is a post-9/11 novel, not just in the obvious literal sense, so in other words, that it was published just a few years after 9/11, but to the extent that it takes the measure of that sense of crisis that has seemed to haunt the West and the United States in particular ever since the destruction of the World Trade Center. So Gray here sees the novel, The Road, as a novel that uses apocalyptic images to engage with fears of decline, of crisis that have haunted the American nation, as well as the West, the Western world more broadly, ever since the attacks of 9/11. So with these ideas in mind, so this sense of 9/11 as an event that can be represented through the image of the apocalypse, let's zoom in on The Road. And first of all, a brief introduction of the author, Cormac McCarthy, who was born in 1933, and you have a few other key dates on the slide and a few other kind of key novels that he has published on the slide. So his first novel was The Orchard Keeper from 1965. He then published a series of books which culminated in Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, which was published in 1985. And Blood Meridian is usually considered Cormac McCarthy's masterpiece. It was praised by famous literary critic Harold Bloom as the ultimate Western, so the best Western ever written, and as one of the best novels of the 20th century. The text tells the story of a band of scalp hunters and their violent expeditions in the West. And this idea of violence, but also the idea of evil, are really some of the main themes that we find in Cormac McCarthy's literary production, as I'm sure you can also see in The Road. The Border trilogy was then published between 1992 and 1998. In 2005, McCarthy published No Country for Old Men, which was turned into a movie by the Coen brothers. It was a very successful movie. Again, you might have seen it. If not, I recommend it. It's quite good. And finally, we get to The Road, 2006, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, which is one of the most important prizes for fiction in the world. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2007. The Road is McCarthy's later novel to date, so he hasn't published any novel ever since. He's published some new material, a screenplay, but no novels at all. And The Road was a major success. As I said, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It was turned into a movie, but it was not just critically acclaimed. It was also very, very popular, especially because in 2007, it was selected for Oprah Winfrey's famous book club. I'm sure you might have heard of Oprah recently because of her interview with Meghan Markle. Oprah is obviously an incredibly popular figure in American TV, so you can imagine that having The Road chosen for one of her programs was quite important because it really granted the novel a very wide audience and a worldwide even resonance. But the fact that The Road was chosen by Oprah for a book club was also interesting for another reason. Oprah actually interviewed McCarthy, and McCarthy is a writer famous for being incredibly private. He usually does not grant interviews, if not very rarely. So to date, in addition to the interview with Oprah, I think we just have 2 other interviews with McCarthy. And when Oprah chose The Road for a TV show, McCarthy actually agreed to appear on screen in his first ever televised interview. So it's really a big moment of popular breakout for his career. And in this interview, McCarthy revealed this inspiration for The Road. So quotation on the slide. 4 or 5 years ago, my son, John, then aged 3 or 4, and I went to El Paso in Texas, and we checked into the old hotel there. And one night, John was asleep. It was probably about 2 a.m, and I went over and just stood and looked out of the window at this town. There was nothing moving, but I could hear the trains going through, a very lonesome sound. I just had this image of what this town might look like in 50 or 100 years. Fires up on the hill and everything being laid to waste. And I thought a lot about my little boy. So I wrote 2 pages. And then about 4 years later, I realized that it wasn't 2 pages of a book. It was a book. And it was about that man and that boy. So this is quite an important element, I think, because there's clearly a biographical element to this novel, to The Road. McCarthy had his son quite late. He was close to 70 when he had his son. So in the novel's exploration of this relationship between the father and son, in the fears that the father of the novel has for his son, we can also read McCarthy's own fears about his son, not being able to be with him, not being able to protect him in the future. So this is another kind of important element to keep in mind when we think about how to read The Road, how to critically interpret The Road. But there are, of course, other possible interpretations of the novel. And first, there's this idea of The Road as a novel concerned with our current environmental risks. So one of the dominant end of the world apocalyptic anxieties at the moment is, of course, climate change and the risk of complete climate breakdown. Now, in his analysis of the environmental imagination and literary texts dealing with the climate crisis, Lawrence Buell is a very famous eco-critic, so somebody that writes about literature in relationship to the environment. Lawrence Buell argues, and again, quotation is on the slide, that the apocalypse is the single most powerful metaphor that the contemporary environmental imagination has at its disposal. So, according to Buell, imagining the apocalyptic end of our natural world, the natural world that supports human life, like The Road does, is the most powerful way to awaken the audience's, the reader's environmental consciousness, to make them aware of the kind of environmental risks that we face. And in his review of The Road for The Guardian, activist George Monbiot makes a very similar point when he describes The Road as the most important environmental book ever written. Monbiot writes that McCarthy's thought experiment exposes the one terrible fact to which our technological hubris blinds us. Our dependence on biological production remains absolute. So what happens in McCarthy's The Road as a result of the death of the natural world, of the biosphere, so the death of vegetation, animals, etc., is the absolute collapse of civilization. So the government has collapsed, mankind is back to the basics of mere survival, mankind feeds on the remains of the pre-apocalyptic world. Some people, as I said, even resort to cannibalism. So The Road reminds us that our dependence on the natural world, on the biosphere, is total, absolute. Without the natural world, the novel suggests, there can be no civilization. The whole future of humanity is really quite doubtful in the world of the novel. And what makes The Road such an effective, powerful environmentalist text is that the depictions of The Road's natural world never really give us any hope that the ecosystem can regenerate. So we read in the novel that everything is dead to the root. We read that trees are charred, they're limbless because of the fires that followed the catastrophe. We read that the whole world, the whole country has been burned away, And of course, we read that animals are nearly extinct. So it is really this kind of extreme, complete collapse of nature, which is becoming more and more of a real possibility for our own world that the road explores. On the slide, you have a tweet from a few years ago where Monbiot writes that the real horror of both the novel and our current environmental risks is really the possibility of too little life. So with this kind of argument in mind, let's take a closer look at the road's landscape. So the opening of the novel really immediately plunges us, puts us into this kind of really gloomy post-apocalyptic atmosphere. We encounter nights dark beyond darkness and the days more grey, each one, than what had gone before. So there's an absolute kind of monochromatic world around us as we read this book. And it's something that the movie actually reflects quite closely, as you can see from that still on the slide. So there is this sense that the absolute absence of light, there is no sun really, it's all grey, kind of reverses the biblical story of the book of Genesis, where you have that separation of light from darkness, which marks the beginning, the creation of the world. So the darkness of the road really suggests that the whole world, the whole creation is coming to an end. So black and grey dominate the post-apocalyptic world, and only man-made objects have retained some colour. So nature has lost all of its colours, which of course symbolises the death of nature, right? So the sea, for instance, if you remember, if you've read the novel, you might remember that the sea is not blue anymore, but grey. The snow turns black because there is this kind of ash everywhere, and even the light is grey. And conveying this idea of too little life that was in that tweet from a few slides ago, the father talks about the world shrinking down about a raw core of parsable entities, the names of things slowly following those things into oblivion, colors, the names of birds, things to eat, finally the names of things one believed to be true, more fragile than he would have thought. How much was gone already? The sacred idiom shorn of its reference and so of its reality. So in the dying world of the road, words simply stop having meanings because what they refer to, colors, birds, foods, they've all stopped existing. So words don't have meanings anymore. And this kind of deterioration of language is one of the ways in which McCarthy creates this dystopian post-apocalyptic world, a world that really doesn't have any kind of possibility for a future. So the apocalypse of the road is also a matter of language. So it's an apocalypse of meaning. Words are dying, just like nature and civilization. And I think that the passage on the slide is quite interesting because it really gives you a sense of the stylistic elements of the novel. So if you take a closer look at the passage, you will see that all unnecessary punctuation, so commas, colons, they're all eliminated. So there is really this sense that language itself is falling apart, kind of linguistic conventions don't hold anymore. As I'm sure you've noticed, again, if you've read the novel, the road doesn't have any apostrophes or quotation marks. And the lack of quotation marks in particular creates dialogues in which the person who speaks is unclear. So this really leaves the reader disoriented. We don't know who's speaking. And this really helps stressing once again how different, how other this post-apocalyptic world is from our own world. Again, looking at the passage on the slide, you can see how the sentences in The Road are, for the most part, very short. They're simple, declarative sentences. There are no subordinate clauses. So again, this reflects this kind of forced simplification of language. So the prose of the novel is really simplified, stripped down, like the landscape that the characters are traveling through. And the narrative itself, the story, is not organized in chapters, right, in traditional chapters. It's organized in very, very short paragraphs. And again, this suggests this sense of fragmentation, deterioration of meaning. Something else that is interesting about this passage is the idea of parsible in the second line on the slide, parsible entities. If you don't know what parsible means, don't worry, it's not you. It's a word that actually McCarthy creates. It's a neologism. So McCarthy often uses very obscure, archaic words in The Road, or neologisms, words that he creates, as in the case of parsible. And this, again, I think really points to how McCarthy is trying to estrange us from language. Language itself in this novel becomes different, becomes strange to us. It's not traditional standard English, which again contributes to create this completely other, different world. Another important frame of reference for McCarthy's The Road is, of course, as the title of the novel suggests, the image of the road. This is really an image that is quite central to American literature and culture more broadly. The motif of the road, of the journey, is a very American motif. And the importance of this image really derives from the fact that American history itself has been a history of journeys, right? Think about the journeys of colonization from the old world to the new world. Think about the journeys of the Pilgrim Fathers. Think about also the pioneers, right? The journeys of the pioneers from the East to the West. So on the slide, you have a few examples of this, that give you a sense of the importance of the image of the road in American literature and culture. So for instance, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957, or the movie Easy Rider from 1969. These are both good examples of the importance of the motif of the road in American narratives. Both examples are part of the counterculture of the 60s. So they celebrate rebellion, freedom, values which run contrary to the norms of society. And the journey becomes a metaphor for this rebellion, for this freedom. Equally, Thelma and Louise, a 1991 road movie, despite its tragic ending, celebrates the liberating idea of an open road, a journey that does not have a set destination, but which really helps the characters on their journey of self-discovery. And I'm sure you've already realized that nothing could be further away from the road of McCarthy's novel. McCarthy's Road really does something completely different from the typical roads of American literature and culture. So roads, obviously, if you think about roads in general, roads typically take us somewhere. They provide us with a direction. But in McCarthy's novel, the road doesn't really seem to take the characters anywhere. So the father and son are originally moving south towards a coast, hoping that the climate there will be warmer. But once they get to the sea, the coast is dead, and it's as inhospitable as the lands they crossed to get there. So they continue walking, but this time there is no sense of a destination in sight. So this really stresses just how hopeless this journey is. And the impression conveyed by this sense that there is no destination for these characters is almost claustrophobic. There is this sense that no road could ever take the survivors anywhere. People in this novel seem to be condemned to be always on the move because the world that they now live in cannot provide them with a shelter, with a home. They keep on walking because they can't do anything else. It's also interesting to consider the vehicles of this post-apocalyptic road narrative. So David Letterman, exploring the image of the car, one of the icons of the many literary and filmic road narratives, Letterman argues that the car celebrates technology as a liberating force that can lead us into the future. But in McCarthy's The Road, this potential of technology, this sense of technology of the car as driving us into the future, is denied. The car, when it appears in the novel by McCarthy, appears as a form of prison. So the father and son come across people who were burnt alive in their cars, possibly when the apocalypse happened. The only vehicle in working order that the father and son encounter is the truck of the bad guys that you can see on the slide. And the bad guys are, of course, the cannibals. So the fact that the cannibals are moving on a truck gives them an unfair advantage, a very dangerous advantage over the survivors. And the protagonists, of course, don't travel with a car, but they use a shopping cart. And again, you can see this still from the movie representing the father and son with the shopping cart. Susan Colling reminds us that the cart serves as a reminder of the excess and waste that marks daily life for many Americans, and that it represents the system whose collapse has created such despair. So Colling, again, is reading The Road as a novel engaged with environmental risks. And so she argues that the cart serves to remind readers of that kind of world of excess, of waste that characterized the pre-apocalypse, because the cart is, of course, a shopping cart. So if you think about a shopping cart in our own world, it represents consumerism, right? You use it as a supermarket, for instance. But also it might remind us of the waste of food that often characterizes our world. It's also important to note that often the cart actually makes the journey on the road quite difficult for the father and son, because of course the road is not really clear, but is full of debris. So the cart often breaks down, the father and son have to find a new one, and that isn't often easy. So once again, you find a vehicle that, unlike the typical cars of road narratives, slows the protagonist down. This cart really doesn't drive them into the future. But also, the cart reminds us of contemporary homeless people. So it emphasizes this idea that I was discussing a few moments ago, that in this future world, the characters are effectively homeless. So no road, no journey can take them to a home, to a safe shelter. So to go back to my opening discussion and to close this lecture, to go back to my opening discussion of the apocalyptic imagination, really the father and son's post-apocalyptic journey in The Road really gives us this contemporary sense of apocalypse. So apocalypse as a dystopian catastrophe rather than, of course, utopian revelation. So thanks very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
No, Diletta, there are no questions. I have a question for you, Diletta. Can I?
Yeah.
While you were explaining and describing the road, I was thinking of Ballard.
Mm-hmm.
Did he influence? I mean, did he had an impact on McCarthy narrative and the road and the story of the road? Because there are quite some similar situation in High Rise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know if McCarthy has read Ballard, so I wouldn't be able to tell you for sure. But you are right that obviously there is in both novels this sense of a disintegration of society.
Cannibalism.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. Cannibalism. So it's an interesting kind of parallel. I don't know if it's read Ballard, but definitely interesting echoes there. Yeah.
Okay.
Was it clear enough? Did you have any questions at all? Anything that you would like me to explain?
Maddalena has a question.
Ok.
Grazie, buongiorno. Posso parlare in italiano?
Vai.
Mi piacerebbe sapere, perché mi è sorta questa curiosità, diciamo, se la motivazione alla base proprio della necessità della distopia e quindi del genere apocalittico è soltanto un desiderio di, diciamo, ammonire la propria comunità, o può anche starci alla base un qualcosa di personale dell'autore o nella sua precisa biografia e psicologia, o addirittura nel senso proprio di sapere già che questa distopia non accadrà nella sua vita, che lui può, tra virgolette, ritenersi salvo? Magari una
Sì, no, è una domanda molto interessante perché ovviamente appunto nel caso di The Road c'è quest'idea dell'elemento biografico del figlio, no? di McCarthy, preoccupato appunto per questo figlio che non sa bene in che tipo di futuro vivrà, perché ovviamente appunto McCarthy è già abbastanza anziano quando ha questo figlio. Ma poi più in generale ovviamente c'è sempre questo senso che chi scrive o soprattutto in realtà l'audience, no? C'è sempre questa idea che persone magari che guardano spesso film, disaster movies e cose di questo genere si pongono spesso come i survivors. Quindi il nostro tipo di identificazione con la storia è dal punto di vista di chi sopravvive piuttosto che di chi ovviamente perisce all'interno delle catastrofi. Quindi c'è decisamente questo senso di appunto giocare con appunto le spinte, sì, il desiderio di sopravvivere, di vedersi appunto come i vincitori in qualche modo in queste situazioni distopiche. Però appunto è interessante in McCarthy secondo me il senso che questa identificazione con i vincitori, con i survivors, secondo me ha poca durata, perché sì, sono sopravvissuti, però insomma, cioè, quanto possano sopravvivere in futuro rimane. Il padre ovviamente... Vabbè, non dico più di tanto perché non vorrei appunto dire più di tanto per chi non ha letto il romanzo, però il senso di che cosa può succedere nel futuro di questi due protagonisti è molto incerto, no? Quindi quell'idea che tu stavi descrivendo appunto di identificarsi con i survivors è un po' eliminata in questo romanzo. Però in generale penso che ci sia molto questo senso della letteratura distopica come una letteratura didattica da un certo punto di vista, no? Quindi una letteratura che viene scritta per insegnare qualcosa, per ammonire appunto, per dare questo senso di quasi una profezia da un certo punto di vista, no? Dovete fare attenzione a questi particolari elementi perché se non fate attenzione questo tipo di scenario potrebbe avverarsi. E cautionary tale, sì, esatto. Sì. Grazie per la domanda.
Grazie mille.
Non so se ci sono altre domande. No?
Posso farlo io?
Sì, certo.
Ok, no, tendevo ad aspettare perché volevo insomma, che ci fosse qualche studente magari, però se nessuno parla mi ci arrischio. Allora, innanzitutto questo è un romanzo che fa veramente tremare le vene, insomma è una cosa, io l'ho letto qualche anno fa, 7-8 anni fa, e insomma lo ricordo come una sorta di sogno e di incubo al contempo.
Certo.
È un'esperienza notevole, insomma, che io consiglio a tutti perché c'è dentro tantissimo proprio. E tra l'altro poi ascoltando questa relazione mi è venuto in mente che anche un altro romanzo che lei ha citato, e forse uno dei miei preferiti, è quello di Safran Foer sul il bambino che perde il padre, così. E è stato un caso perché non avevo mai riflettuto al fatto che appunto questi due romanzi sono forse fra i miei preferiti in assoluto. Comunque la domanda è questa. Io avevo letto anche qualche decennio fa, forse Dissipazio HG di Guido Morselli, che è un romanzo appunto anche questo apocalittico, che era stato studiato da un docente della statale quando ero all'università, insomma 20 anni fa, e Pischedda mi sembra si chiamasse questo docente. Però quello era un po' una riflessione sul lato oscuro dell'Italia del benessere. Mentre in questo caso mi sembra che ci sia molta, lei a un certo punto ha parlato, no, di questa rivelazione dell'Occidente, no? Ecco, mi sembra di capire che ci sia forse la possibilità di una lettura allegorica della ferita narcisistica dell'Occidente che si trova, insomma, ad essere anche con il 9/11, anche con la catastrofe ambientale, un po', insomma, appunto umiliato, no? Allora, non so se sia possibile o se è troppo delirante questa, diciamo, lettura internazionale, geopolitica, non so, di un Occidente che ormai si trova rispetto alla Cina, rispetto ad altri soggetti, così un po' messo da parte, no?
Sì, no, assolutamente, cioè, c'è decisamente questo aspetto. Quello che è interessante è che molti di questi romanzi, compreso ovviamente The Road, sono ambientati negli Stati Uniti, anche se l'autore in questione può essere non statunitense. Quindi è come se appunto gli Stati Uniti, come ovviamente questa rappresentazione un po' simbolica dell'Occidente, diventi appunto il luogo preferito in cui immaginare scenari distopici e apocalittici, quindi da quel punto di vista assolutamente. E è il caso ad esempio di un libro come The Pest House di Jean Crace, che è appunto un autore contemporaneo inglese che però immagina appunto uno scenario post-apocalittico in America. O anche Cloud Atlas, che è un altro romanzo che magari appunto conoscete, anche perché appunto c'è stato un film, anche quello, appunto l'autore David Mitchell è inglese, però immagina la post-apocalisse in Hawaii, quindi comunque negli Stati Uniti. Questa cosa per me è interessante perché diciamo che alle origini del Nuovo Mondo, il Nuovo Mondo era visto da Colombo come un mondo apocalittico, proprio nel senso etimologico dell'appunto nuovo mondo utopico, cioè Colombo parlava nei suoi diari del mondo che stava andando a scoprire come appunto il nuovo mondo che gli era stato rivelato da Dio. E quindi c'è questa completa inversione appunto nella letteratura contemporanea, post-apocalittico contemporaneo, di questo immaginario appunto di questo nuovo mondo che era considerato il nuovo mondo, no, della promessa, del futuro, eccetera, e invece diventa appunto questo luogo di completo collasso, insomma. Quindi decisamente c'è questo senso dell'Occidente che si confronta con se stesso appunto negli Stati Uniti.
Scusi, posso chiederle di nuovo come si chiama quel romanzo che ha citato, il primo, quello inglese?
Sì, The Pest House, che in italiano è stato tradotto con una roba allucinante, tipo la verità dell'amore, cioè una cosa che non ha assolutamente nulla a che fare col titolo inglese. The Pest House, si chiama lui Jim Crace. ed è un romanzo veramente bellissimo. Jim Crace in generale è uno scrittore fantastico che io appunto ho avuto la fortuna di studiare e di conoscere, e quindi di lui io veramente raccomando tutto, perché è bravissimo Jim Crace. Non so se ci sono altre domande. C'è una mano alzata.
C'è una mano alzata della mamma.
Esatto, infatti. Vai, fammi questa domanda.
Okay. It's a reflection and a question, both of them. So I was thinking of Orwell. In Newspeak,
Yeah.
There is a gradual shrinking of the language
Yeah.
in order to eliminate concepts, especially when they are dangerous, okay?
Mm-hmm.
In The Road, instead, I was just reflecting on it while you were talking. It is things which disappear, therefore making language vain, inadequate. Now, if we think of the latest developments, text messaging, and whatever, do we have to infer that language is in danger? Because I'm really worried. And you know that I'm very keen on language. So.
You are very keen on it. I mean, I don't necessarily think that McCarthy is trying to make a kind of general point about language in general. And actually, what's interesting about Newspeak is that, of course, Orwell's 1984 ends with an appendix that actually makes clear, that is an appendix about Newspeak, that actually makes clear that Newspeak itself is no more. So that actually all that kind of deterioration of language that the Big Brother and the government have produced is no more, because the world has moved on. So in many ways, the appendix about Newspeak is actually the moment in which Orwell's book becomes hopeful, because it's revealed that, of course, the regime has collapsed. And so that there is a future after the dystopian regime. In terms of McCarthy, again, I don't think he's necessarily making a general point about language. I think that as a writer, he's of course fascinated with language, and language is one of the ways in which he conjures up, creates this post-apocalyptic world. Experimentations with language in post-apocalyptic novels are quite common. So, of course, I mean, I've spoken about McCarthy and how he uses neologisms, or he kind of reflects upon language kind of shrinking down. But there are other examples of novels that are written in imagined post-apocalyptic dialects. So, for instance, Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker, which is a novel from the 80s, a novel about a kind of nuclear catastrophe and a world a kind of post-apocalyptic world set about 2,000 years after a nuclear catastrophe. That novel is entirely written in an imagined post-apocalyptic language. So it's a dialect. It's really, really hard to read. You have to read it out loud, because if you read it out loud, you can actually understand, because you hear the words, because otherwise, if you just read it on the page, you don't really understand what's going on. David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas as well, the central section is again written partly in a post-apocalyptic language. Will Self's The Book of Dave, again, parts written in a post-apocalyptic language. So there is a lot of kind of experimentation with language when it comes to the post-apocalyptic genre, to reflect upon what an imagined post-apocalyptic future could look like when it comes to language. And so, yeah, there's quite a lot of it. But I don't necessarily think that they're trying to make a general point about our world and what's happening with language. I think it's just an attempt at being realistic, because, of course, if you're imagining a world that is so far removed from ours, that is so far in the future, then you have to think about how language might have evolved. And, of course, if there's been an apocalypse, then that catastrophe might have actually, for instance, destroyed books, destroyed libraries. So what would that do to language? It's a way of being realistic, I think.
But yeah. because you are in an extreme situation and you need only necessary words.
Yeah,
The point.
yeah, absolutely.
I think that in Orwell's aim of creating Newspeak was more political.
Yes.
The aim of Newspeak was to control people's mind and people's thinking. Here is in a different situation.
Yeah.
No, ma se qualche ragazzo, più che chiedere su The Road, volesse chiederle qualcosa anche cioè di studi futuri, non lo so, se Diletta ha voglia di parlarne.
Sì,
di
sì.
solito quando facciamo orientamento in uscita, insomma, cioè se tu hai no, insomma.
Sì, sì, cioè se può essere utile, volentieri se avete qualche domanda su cosa succede dopo la maturità.
Motta ha una domanda, Chiara, c'è una manina alzata.
Sì, buongiorno. No, in realtà la mia domanda era ancora su The Road.
Certo.
Mi sono resa conto adesso leggendo gli appunti, però vorrei partire dal presupposto che io non ho letto il libro, quindi in realtà la mia domanda potrebbe essere ingiustificata.
Non ti preoccupare.
Ok, grazie. Mi sono resa conto che non si parla della figura della donna, cioè anche i due protagonisti sono entrambi maschili,
Sì.
e mi chiedevo se potesse essere una metafora per il fatto che la donna appunto rimane incinta, quindi fa figli, e potesse essere appunto una metafora per la fine anche del genere umano.
Sì, sì, no, assolutamente, è veramente un'ottima osservazione. Ci sono due figure femminili, una è la madre del bambino protagonista, però è una figura femminile che sparisce, cioè è una figura che viene ricordata, ma non fa parte, diciamo, del presente di questo romanzo, no? È solo ricordata. Non ti dico tanto, quello che succede a questa figura, perché non vorrei appunto fare spoiler, diciamo. Però sì, è una figura che ha un ruolo molto molto limitato, e poi c'è una figura finale, di nuovo femminile, proprio nelle ultime pagine del libro, che appare, e che quindi potrebbe dare qualche speranza per questo mondo, perché hai assolutamente ragione. Ovviamente diciamo che così come la natura appunto in questo romanzo è morta, diciamo, e ovviamente la natura è tipicamente associata appunto a una madre natura, quindi tipicamente associata con figure femminili, così anche appunto non sembra esserci granché figure femminili. Alla fine appunto appare questa madre di un'altra famiglia, diciamo, e lì le interpretazioni cioè sono differenti. Ci sono dei critici che hanno un'interpretazione positiva della fine, che quindi vedono questa fine del romanzo come una possibile apertura, diciamo, un possibile futuro. Io personalmente non sono d'accordo con queste interpretazioni, credo che non ci sia una grande speranza, però insomma diciamo che simbolicamente è effettivamente rilevante che una figura femminile appare alla fine, quindi sì.
Perfetto, grazie.
Figurati.
Una domanda che volevo farti io sulla fine, perché infatti io mi ricordavo, si vede che sono più ottimista, io me lo ricordavo un filo ottimista alla fine.
Ottimista, sì.
Quindi si può, cioè mi sembrava una speranza fine, come dire.
Tu hai visto il film, Angela?
No, perché
no, okay.
Quando mi piacciono i libri, il film ho visto l'inizio e non mi piaceva come...
No, perché stavo per dire che se avevi un'interpretazione positiva, forse era anche, appunto, se hai visto se tu avessi visto il film, quello anche può cambiare, perché il film è più positivo, la fine è molto più positiva.
No, non ho visto il film, ho letto il libro, mi basta il libro, cioè nel senso che non voglio rovinarmi il libro.
Anch'io ho letto il libro e ho visto il film, effettivamente il film ha una visione, diciamo, un pochino più ottimista. Forse perché la deve dare il film, la cinematografia può darsi che dia questa visione un po' più positiva, però effettivamente il libro
esatto,
è un'interpretazione.
Sì. Cioè il film, vabbè, è interessante perché il film, ad esempio, appunto come dicevo, il film è interamente non in bianco e nero, perché non sarebbe corretto, però diciamo che è molto monocromatico, e poi a un certo punto alla fine ci sono dei colori tutto a un tratto, quindi già quello ti dà un senso più positivo, diciamo. Il libro è diverso, secondo me, perché è vero che c'è questo spiraglio, diciamo, di speranza. Appunto, non vorrei dare troppo via, quindi non dico più di tanto. C'è uno spiraglio, però gli ultimi 2 paragrafi del libro sono dei paragrafi in cui c'è questa voce che è disembodied, è una voce che non si capisce bene di chi sia, che parla del mondo precedente. E parla del mondo precedente e in particolare parla di... C'è questa immagine di questi pesci nel fiume e la voce dice che questi pesci nel fiume, che appunto del mondo preapocalittico, avevano sui loro dorsi delle mappe, maps of the world in its becoming, quindi questo senso di becoming, ma ovviamente questi pesci non ci sono più e la voce è molto nostalgica di questo mondo naturale che è finito. Quindi per me, sulla base di questi 2 paragrafi finali, insomma, io penso che questi 2 paragrafi finali un po' mettano tutto quello che succede prima, che è un po' più positivo, diciamo di nuovo in una luce abbastanza priva di speranza. Però, ripeto, ci sono effettivamente interpretazioni diverse, c'è chi ha un'interpretazione molto più positiva della fine rispetto a me, diciamo. Quindi, sì.
Però lascia un'interpretazione, lascia libera in fondo ad un'interpretazione, oppure come...
Assolutamente.
Non può interpretare magari, però effettivamente anch'io questa.
Assolutamente, anche perché l'ultima proprio parola del libro è mystery, quindi è una parola che appunto ovviamente lascia tutto molto aperto, quindi poi ognuno ci legge, diciamo, un po' quello che vuole, no?
O ci spera.
Ci spera, esatto. Esatto.
Fabio Marca dice che Cristina ha alzato la mano, ho capito bene o no?
Yeah.
Cristina.
No, questa roba. Can you turn on your cameras, please? Adesso I'm turning on my camera. Due domande. First, aiutami a capire bene, per favore, cosa succede a questa language che del romanzo che ho letto un po' di anni fa e lo ricordo, lo rimembro, come mi viene da dire, come una roba terrificante. Tra l'altro, con un gioco abbastanza perverso, mi era stato regalato da mia figlia, che non so, ci sono quelle robe che possono fare le figlie alle madri, no? C'è una cosa un po' terrificante. So che molte figlie e molte madri capiranno questo un po' touch perverse. No, allora, com'è diversa la sua lingua dalla lingua del post-trauma? Cioè, mi vengono in mente 2 cose. Allora, ho in mente una lecture che ho sentito un po' di tempo fa di una tipa di Yale che parla del language in realtà del dopoguerra, primo dopoguerra, ok? Questo inability, you cannot really use the language as it used to do. Because how can you describe a young man that is being blown up in front of you, your best friend, torn to pieces? Ok, questa roba qua, per cui la via è quella di scegliere questo linguaggio che diventa, no? O lo guardi un po' di lato, oppure you reduce it to nothing. E il grande maestro americano di questa reduction to nothing è Hemingway, no? Che, per cui parli di questa cosa. Guarda, ho mandato adesso ai miei di quinta, poveretti, On the Quay at Smyrna, che non so se tu hai letto questa 2 pages, front and back, di questa situazione terrificante dove lui dice no, they were good too, questi qua che spaccavano le gambe ai muli, che li buttavano nell'acqua, però questi bambini, difficile da tirare via le madri, no? Le donne con i bambini morti erano un po' problematiche perché non volevano mollarli. C'è questo linguaggio qua, no? Che diventa proprio ridotto a niente. Certo. Che però per Hemingway è un po' anche una bella tradizione ricca, se vuoi, cioè povera ma ricca del giornalismo, per cui get rid of all the unnecessary language, ok? So you reduce it to... quanto di questo linguaggio qua è trauma? So, you cannot like really, what can you do with it? You just reduce it to nothing. Oppure si sta inventando qualcosa di nuovo, cioè questa roba qua. E poi la seconda invece domanda rivolta al futuro, anche magari non è così un futuro lietissimo, è: abbiamo avuto delle degli insights da qualcuno che ti sta vicino, che ha detto che stai già lavorando sul post-pandemic. Do you have a sense? What's going to happen?
Am I working on the post-pandemic? No, I'm working on...
Thinking about it.
I'm working on sleep at the moment. I'm working on sleep.
Post-pandemic, yeah.
Thinking about it, you know.
Yeah. I'm working on representations of sleep in contemporary culture and the idea of the sleep crisis. So this idea that contemporary society is chronically sleep deprived. So the new project is about sleep in contemporary fiction, non-fiction, so memoirs, self-help, but also digital culture, so stuff like sleep trackers, blogs. But yeah, there's a lot of research on COVID and how it has impacted sleep. So in that sense, there is a little bit of a post-pandemic dimension. But no, going back to your question on language, yes, absolutely. I mean, you can interpret it as a language informed by trauma. So of course, that goes in that kind of direction of kind of trauma studies, interpretations of the novel. I think that what's interesting and what's different from a person, for instance, like Hemingway that you were mentioning, is that McCarthy really does away with a lot of conventions. So again, there are no kind of quotation marks. There's basically kind of like very few punctuation marks. I think only periods really are used. I'm trying to think about it, but I think that just full stops are used. So there's nothing else. So it's very pared down in that sense. So and also very often the sentences are very short and very declarative. So there is this sense of really kind of like the language losing conventions. And so in that sense, I think it's a little bit different. But definitely you can interpret it as a language of trauma. There are some neologisms that he coins in the novel. And so again, it goes back to that kind of question about language and the post-apocalypse. So kind of creating words for a new reality, basically. So I think it's a mix of different kind of aspects of the apocalyptic imagination between the kind of traumatic, but also, again, the fact that it's a different kind of strange reality and you need to find new language, different language to represent it.
Does he always write like this? Does he change his language for this book?
No. Blood Meridian, for instance, is very, very Baroque. Like the language, for instance, I don't really like it because it's too much. Like the language is very rich. It's very, like the sentences are big, long. So no, it's The Road that is written like that. No Country for Old Men, potentially a little bit similar to The Road. So it's later style, which is something quite common, right? The late style of authors sometimes tends to be quite pared down as opposed to their early style. So yeah.
Great. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you.
Non so se ci siano altre domande.
Parlando senza essere sentita, sì, avevo il microfono spento. Allora, sì, ho detto che devo lasciarvi, ti ho fatto i complimenti e grazie. Grazie per l'incontro.
No,
e speriamo in un futuro roseo, non così negativo.
Assolutamente. Grazie a lei per aver partecipato.
Any recommendation? Any recommendation for the summer readings?
For the summer reading, what did I read? I'm thinking. So I'm reading. Let me just. Kind of depends if it's something that you're interested in, but Detransition Baby. So it's been longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction is by a trans author. So it's really interesting on gender issues.
The transition
baby. And it's been published in, I think, 2021. No, 2020. 2020. So yeah.
Sorry, the author. What's the name of
Torrey Peters.
Torrey Peters.
Oh, oui.
Yeah.
It's a British.
No, I think she's American.
Oh.
Yeah, American. Yeah. So yeah, this is something I recommend. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I've read recently. I'm like looking around. There was a book in translation recently that I've read that is quite good by a Japanese author, which is called "There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job." I can't remember. I'm just going to write the title, but I can't remember the name of the book. No such thing as an easy. Which is quite interesting. It's about burnout, and work, and it's very interesting and very well written. So yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bene, penso che possiamo salutarci.
Okay.
Da Northumbria, che ci trovi lì perché appunto è una ricercatrice del Dipartimento di Scienze Umane di Northumbria University. Un saluto dall'Italia e qui un saluto dal Regno Unito.
Esatto.
Speriamo di vederci
di persona presto.
Presto.
Certo.
Sì.
No, grazie ancora davvero per l'invito e grazie appunto dell'attenzione. Insomma, è stato bello rivedervi.
Va bene.
Grazie, arrivederci allora.
Grazie.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Saluto.
Arrivederci a tutti.